Donc, bonjour tout le monde et bonjour les gens à McGill, qu'on voit toujours un peu dans l'ombre, mais ça nous fait plaisir de vous avoir avec nous. Donc, il nous fait plaisir aujourd'hui d'avoir avec nous Catherine Deri Armstrong du département de sciences économiques de l'Université d'Ottawa, qui vient nous présenter un séminaire dont le titre est affiché à l'écran, The Long-Term Effects of Maternal Employment on Daughters' Later Labor Force Participation and Earnings. Et je suis très curieuse personnellement d'entendre les résultats de son travail, donc je lui laisse la parole. Et donc voilà.
Merci. Mais j'ai pas besoin de ça. Okay. So Danielle, you're interested in the results because you have children.
Yeah,
and you
I have a daughter.
And you want to know what's going to happen to her. Got it. Okay. So I won't keep you in suspense too long with the results. Thank you very much, Matthew, Jean, Danielle, for having me out. This is joint work with Ross Finney from the University of Ottawa and Jennifer Stewart, a colleague from Carleton. So you're all aware that the biggest change, I think I said this, but just so everyone knows, if you have any questions, I'd rather hear them as we go. And English or French, I will do my best to reply. So I think everyone's familiar that the most striking change in the labor force over the past 30, 35 years has been the drastic increase in female labor force participation. And aspects of this, we know a lot of these studies have been studies, the impact on family structure, on fertility, on family bargaining, on women's health, not good, on the health of the spouse, not so good either. But because women are often mothers, the impact of the mother working, the impact on children has also been studied. And I'm going to go. The literature that looks at the effect of maternal employment on child outcomes looks at obviously various different outcomes. They've looked at cognitive outcomes. So in general, here we're looking at cognitive outcomes for a child 11 years of age or younger. The literature is there's a lot of evidence. I have them in order of the people who find negative effects, no effects, and bounce around, some positive, some depends on the sample, positive and negative effects. So there really is no general consensus, but in general, if you take an average, you'd say maternal employment has negative effects on cognitive outcomes. Behavioral outcomes, Michael Baker, related to what we were just talking about downstairs, Baker, Milligan, and Gruber, I should be careful. Look at the policy change in Quebec, this $5 a day, now $7 a day daycare. This had an impact on maternal employment and what happened to children's behavioral outcomes, and finds negative effects. Okay. The later two papers look at the effects on risky behavior. A mother working, does this have an effect on the daughter's, I think they were looking at smoking, sex, and I think they don't find any statistically significant impacts, but LOPU does find a negative effect on teenage pregnancy. Okay, and there's also been evidence that maternal employment, this is the health outcome here, is associated with worse obesity in children, higher rates of obesity in children. Okay, but what all this literature has in common is that they're looking at the effect of current maternal employment on current child outcomes. Okay, what's lacking in general, we go use the other thing, is much evidence of the long-term effects. Okay, and obviously if you have some, and it wasn't 100% clear that every effect is negative in what I was just showing you, but there's certainly some concern that maternal employment is having some negative impact on child outcomes. In the long term, though, everyone here uses data. You can understand that it's not so easy to know because you need some kind of some data that spans a long enough time period. So Ermish and Francisco used the British Household Panel Survey and look at the impact of maternal employment, generally when the child was quite young, 6 and under, on the educational attainment of young adults. Okay, and they find that in general, maternal employment is associated with maternal employment between the ages of 0, 1, and 6, younger than 6, is associated with lower academic attainment. And the latter two are looking at Germany and Denmark. I believe it goes Germany, Denmark, but I could be wrong. Looking at the effect of policy changes in those countries where they extended maternity leave from about 6 weeks to 4 months. Okay, so they're identifying the effect off of changes of maternal employment at a very young age. Okay, but their outcomes Dustman and Schoenberg are looking at the outcome of weight. Oh, I'm going to forget which one's which. I think it's wages and educational attainment, and find no effect in the long term for young adults, while Wirtz finds, oh, I'm going to forget now. Finds. No, neither of them find any impact. It's all no impact. But again, don't forget they're looking at the effect of a policy change going from 6 weeks of maternity leave to 4 months. So again, this is maternal employment at a very young age. Okay, so what is it that we do? Now I'm going to have to, there we go. What do? We look at the long-run effect of maternal employment when the so we're only going to look at daughters. We could talk about why that's of interest to you. Basically, because there's more variation in daughters, men. I'll come back to that. The long-run impact of maternal employment when the daughter is between 1 and 17 years of age. So not just what's happening at the very beginning, on measures of daughters' labor force participation when she's between 20 and 40. So we're not just looking at young adults, we're looking at older adults, as it were. And the two outcomes that we look at, the probability of working and conditional on working, how much they're earning. Okay, so just to go back, why are we looking at daughters, not sons? There's not as much variation with sons in terms of employment. There'd be more in terms of earnings. And as you'll see, the scope of our paper is already quite large, that restricting the sample right now to daughters seems more manageable. But of course we care about them. Okay. So what's unique about our paper, or what's, the special qualities? First of all, we're one of the few papers that are able to look at the long-run effect of maternal employment. And as I said, we've got maternal employment not just in the early years, but up to 17 years of maternal employment information. The outcomes are a full spectrum of adult outcomes, and we've got a great database. Okay, so this is a longitudinal administrative database. I'm going to talk about it a bit more later, but this is tax data, so it's a administrative data, tax data, a 20% random sample of all Canadian tax filers. Okay, so it's huge. Okay, but it permits us to look at outcomes and have good information on earnings. We can, with little asterisks here, we can match these daughters to their parents, find the mom, and track the mother back in time. Okay, so we've got maternal employment, outcomes, huge data set. Okay. So you might be thinking, what kind of theory do we have that would predict the effect of maternal employment on any kind of outcome? The Becker-Tomes model, 1986, basically says, look, child outcomes are produced using a combination of maternal time, parental time investments, and investments in market goods. Okay? So if you think about maternal employment clearly takes away the time, but provides more access to higher quantity of market goods. So the prediction of what's going to happen when a mother spends more time working as compared to a mother who didn't, what will be the outcome on the child, really depends on some assumption you'd have to make about the relative importance of these two inputs, the substitutability of these two inputs, and you can imagine that you can make it go in either direction. Right? If time is more important, you're going to have a worse outcome. If market goods are more important, outcomes will be better. There's also a literature from the sociology side. We haven't been able to find exactly who to attribute it to, but it's very well explained and discussed in this paper by Havman and Wolf that says that when a mother works, it changes the socialization process of the daughter. So more specifically, maternal employment will change the preferences of the child by creating specific values about working and attachment to the labor force. So here, it's very much a role model story, and a mother working is going to have a positive impact on the probability that the daughter herself will work because she's changed the values and preferences and attitudes towards working. Okay, so here are the predictions clear. Here, you're going to have to make a few more assumptions to make a true prediction. Okay. So if you think about how we're going to model this, we're going to have some measure of maternal employment ages 1 to 17. I'll obviously be more specific in a few minutes. as a predictor of whether or not the daughter's working, and I wrote working here, but you can also see conditional on working, how much is she earning, controlling for time invariant family characteristics, so other characteristics of the daughter growing up, family income, lone parent status of her household, and the information we have, remember this is tax data, on the daughter's current situation, right? Is she herself married right now? We'll have to get back to that. I can't remember offhand. Okay, but you can well imagine if this is all I ran, you'd say, well, you wouldn't necessarily be all that convinced that the beta coefficient, the coefficient on maternal employment, would be capturing a causal impact, right? You'd be worried that, more specifically, there's a big identification problem, right? It's not random what mother is going to work. And if the kind of mother that chooses to work has any kind of characteristic that's unobserved in the regression that's correlated with the daughter's later outcomes, you're going to either over or underestimate the true effect depending on the nature of this relationship, right? So the idea that the mother who chooses to work may be different in terms of abilities, skill, preferences that choose not to work that could be correlated with the outcomes that we care about means that we have to think very carefully about how we're going to go and estimate a causal impact. So we do this in 3 ways. We've got 3 different strategies we can use. First, used in many of the papers that we cited earlier, a sister fixed effect, including the Ermish and Francisconi, the British household panel survey that looks at the long-term outcomes. So the idea here is that we're going to use variation across sister pairs. Okay? So in the data, we're going to have a lot of sister pairs. You can argue. You'll look at them and you can see how many is a lot. Was that your question? We've got a slide. Of sister pairs, and we're going to use variation in when a mother works more or less for one child versus the other on the daughter's outcomes, right? So what it does is it soaks out, it controls for any common fixed characteristic of the mother over time. So fixed preferences, fixed values that don't change between daughters, and you can compare a daughter for which the mother worked more and less to see what the outcome was. Okay? That's pretty straightforward. The second strategy we're going to use is instrumental variables. Okay, so here what we need to identify a causal impact is something strongly, hopefully, correlated with the mother's decision to work, uncorrelated in any other way with the daughter's later labor force participation. Okay, so what we use, similar to some of the other papers that we've cited, is the unemployment rate so let's say we have 10 years of data for the mothers working, so between 82 and 92, say, that makes sense, but just imagine, we use an average of the unemployment rates over those 10 years as an instrument, because these we believe to be predictors of whether or not the mother was working, but it's hard to imagine a story, although we'll have to come back to that later, of how the unemployment rate, between 82 and 92 is going to have an impact on a daughter choosing to work 20 years later. Okay? So we have sister fixed effects, instrumental variables, and the third one, we're going to follow a strategy used in this Gottschalk 96 paper. In that paper, if you're not familiar with it, the author so he's looking at the intergenerational impact of welfare use between mothers and daughters. So how much, if a mother used a lot of welfare growing up, does this increase the probability that a daughter uses welfare later on? And his strategy for identifying this causal impact is he's going to exploit the timing of events. So he says, look, past welfare use of a mother could have a causal impact on whether the daughter herself uses it, right? But let's say you add in this variable, so whether or not the daughter is on welfare today in 2011. Let's say we had a variable for whether the mother is on welfare in 2012 in the regression. That can't possibly have a causal impact on whether the daughter, right, is on welfare this year, right? So if you add a variable for future welfare use of the mother, it can't possibly have a causal impact. If it's statistically significant in a regression, that tells you that it's unobserved heterogeneity, that it's unobserved correlated things that are causing a variable of the mother using welfare in 1 year on the daughter using it in a previous year. So we're going to do the same thing with maternal employment. We've got, let's say we observe a daughter working in 2000, our data doesn't go that high, but in 2003, okay? We're going to use a variable, so we've got this variable for maternal employment when the daughter was 1 to 17. We're going to include another variable, which is maternal employment after, what did I say, 2003? After 2003, so 2004 and 5. Okay? If it's statistically significant, that means we've got an unobserved heterogeneity problem. Okay? And that there is no causal impact. Okay? So these are 3 different strategies, none of which we invented, but all can address the identification problem we discussed. Okay, so Danielle, you'll be very happy to know that even though in a linear you'll be happy that there are no long-term impacts. It's too late. Depends how old your daughter is. But in a linear probability model, so in an OLS, there is a strong positive relationship between a mother working and the daughter's later labor force participation and earnings. And if you look across the distribution of what, if you divide up maternal employment when the daughter was 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 15 to 17, it seems like the relationship is strongest in the later years. So I guess it depends what your daughter is, how old your daughter is, but she's there. But actually, it really doesn't, because in general, when we do any of those 3 strategies, or almost no matter how we cut the data, unobserved heterogeneity is really what's driving the difference, and this positive effect goes away. So you may as well keep your job. Okay. So I'm not trying to sketch over things in most cases. It's not completely crystal clear. So let me tell you a little bit about the data. And Danielle was asking me earlier, wanting to make sure I tell you a little bit how I got access to the data. So please remind me if I forget. So the LAD is a 20% random sample of Canadian tax filers. Okay? All Canadian tax filers. And the rate of tax filing in Canada is estimated to be well over 95%. So this is very, in theory, very representative. Okay, there's over 6 million observations in 2000 alone. The data goes back to 1982. The most recent data that we had access to when we ran this analysis was 2005, but it's going, maybe I shouldn't be so presumptuous. I believe this is going to continue to be maintained. So of course it's longitudinal in nature, so we're following individuals over time. Now you can, so we all file, I assume everyone here files their taxes, so you probably have a good idea of what's in the data. We have everything that you have on your tax file, so that also gives you a good idea of what we don't have, right? Most people here use surveys. There's a lot more, we're losing a lot of the softer information, obviously. But what we do have in addition, so individuals are also matched into family units. Okay? And information about the family, whoever's in the family, is merged onto the individual's record. Okay? So it's not like we just have what's on your individual tax file. If you're married, if you're cohabitating, if you're indicating a spouse on your tax form, we have that information. We have the information on the children. So we have family information over time. So huge, great, very accurate information on income, taxes, deductions, all this kind of thing, at both individual and family levels. What's the trade-off? You know, it's toujours un compromis. Well, the soft stuff. Education, maternal education, probably an important variable in determining whether the daughter works, that we don't have, right? So before I make this sound like we have the best data in the world, you have to be cognizant that it's not 100% perfect. So Danielle asked me earlier how I got access to the data. Well, it started because Ross Finney, one of the co-authors on this paper, came and gave a talk at the University of Ottawa, and I came up with this idea, and I went to Ross after. I'm like, hey, you know, this isn't too far from what you're doing. How could I go about, you know, would you collaborate with me on this? How could we go on and work on this? And at the time, it seemed very possible. It was possible things were going great. Now that I know this is being recorded, I'm getting a little more hesitant about what I'm saying. But the fact is now things have changed in Statistics Canada. They charge a crap load of money. I'm sorry, StatsCan, you do, to access the data on the about $500 per day. And I've never touched the LAD. I've never seen anyone's individual tax records. They run code for us. okay? Which is, as you probably can imagine, a very tough way to run analysis. There's a lot of going back and forth. So getting it right the first time is near impossible. So $500 a day for the number of mistakes I make. Maybe you guys are much better coders than I am. But why am I saying this all badly? So the good news is that the LAD has been approved for the LAD has been given permission to come to the RDC. Whether or not this will happen soon, John's not overly optimistic. I was really planning a lot of things. It's coming. So to the extent that the LAD is fabulous and huge, keep it in mind as a potential source of information for other works. And because, don't forget the SID number is there, the possibility to link this with any other administrative database that is, are you saying no, is just wow, right? Our children will be able to run the most amazing regressions we've seen. There you go. Are there any questions about the LAD in general? No. Okay. So I tried to make this as clear as I could, and I still couldn't get back to 1982 on the train. But here we go. So this is what these are the LAD years across the top. Okay, so 82 is there. You just can't see it to 2005. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all daughters 20 to 40 years of age from 1985 to 2005. Okay, and you'll see the reasons why we obviously don't want to go younger than 20. We want to look at adult outcomes. We can't go over 40 because we want to have some information on maternal employment between ages 1 to 17. So what we're going to do is we're going to have one observation for every daughter year we see her in the data. So a 20-year-old in 2005, we're going to have one outcome observation, but we've got the full 17 years of maternal employment information to use. Okay? For a 30-year-old, we've got however many that is, 11 outcomes, because whether she's working any of those years, how much she's earning, and we've got, well, I can't even figure this, so like 8 to 17 years. We've got maternal employment between the ages of 8 and 17. Okay, so it's very imbalanced the way we're doing this. We're doing this obviously to get the greatest possible data set we can. So obviously for the oldest person in our sample, a 40-year-old in 2005, 21 years of outcomes, and only maternal employment at age 17 to work with. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear about how we construct the sample because this is the complicated part of our, after this it gets simple. This is the complicated part of our paper. Okay? So we start, as I said, picking all daughters, 20 to 40, all the yellow ages we found, between 1985 and 2005. And this is, see, the thing about tax files is there's nothing on your tax file that tells me who your mom is, right? There's nothing about your SIN number that's linked to your mother. The only way we can link a daughter to her mother is if they filed taxes when they were living at home between 15 and 19. Okay. Okay? Now, luckily, but you've got to think critically, right? That happens 70% of the time. So we only lose 30% of people because they didn't file taxes at some point between 15 and 19. Okay? But that's still, we lose 30%. The question is, who are these 30%? There is a big, this is the only thing that really concerns me about this paper. So the way I address this, okay, so the question is, a priori, can you think of one, what would be something that would make a daughter not file taxes between ages of 15 and 17 compared to people that do? So who would be in our data set versus people that don't? Maybe education, because they're in school. So the question is whether or not being in school is highly correlated with maternal employment. And as well, I mean, it has to be two things, right? It can't just be some observable. It has to be some unobservable correlated with both maternal employment and the outcomes we care about. We are currently trying to get a better sense of this, but what we've, thus far in the paper, what we cite are two papers that have used this exact linkage that are published in the QJE and the JHR. So in two top papers, using this linkage, and they do more extensive things than we've actually done to date, and they show that there are no obvious selection issues. So that's not the best answer. I completely concede, and we are trying to get a better sense of trying to figure out who's in and who's out. Because the unfortunate is we can't. Anyway, you're everyone's right to be worried about this. This is the, yeah.
Show the distribution of income, see if they're comparable.
Yeah. That's exactly what we're waiting on. That's what we've asked for. We're waiting.
Oh, okay. I understand.
Yeah, like now that we're thinking about it
similar. It's not
the
worrying.
original draft of the paper. That's now in a revised and resubmit, and they're asking us to pursue this exact at 70% a little bit more. What we had in the draft of the paper we submitted was more explicitly, there's no reason to worry about it, and because we couldn't think, maybe we should have thought a little bit harder. But other papers have used this exact linkage with hardly any worries. And it's 70%. It's not nobody, but the question is, if we're losing the more educated people, really what you think about, like, who are you most worried about? You're really more worried about the people that wouldn't have gone on to do well. So if that's the selection, maybe it's not as much of a problem, because what you're really worried about is what is the effect of maternal employment on the people that may not have for sure done well. I'm completely with you. Okay. So there's the selection there. And that was a typo I meant to change. The stepmother, so we find the mother. To be able to track her back, she has to be in the lab. Right? The lab is a 20% random sample, and I can't believe I didn't fix this typo. That's actually 19.74% actually appear. If the lab was perfect, we'd have 20% of the mothers are in the lab. To follow her back, we have 19.74. Okay? It's near perfect. Okay? And then we also need the mother we need at least one observation for maternal employment, so at least 1 point out of all the data sets we could potentially observe her, she has to have filed her taxes, and that's 99% of the time. So we only lose 1% there. So again, the only selection that you have to worry about is the top one, and I am worried about it. Okay. So in the final sample, we have $94,500 daughters. I wish I had $94,000 daughters. And when you include the fact that we've got multiple observations per daughter, we have over 935,000 observations. Okay? Obviously very enviable. Okay. I don't think I have this on the slide. The only other thing we exclude are daughters that we observe to be in school. So we don't want to look at your working and your earnings when you're currently in school. We could observe your deductions for your scholarly deductions. If you say you're full-time, we exclude observations from that year and the previous. Not all years of the LAD. They changed the rules with respect to those deductions. So just to make sure that if we're not capturing the students properly, we exclude everyone under 25, assuming that most people who don't go on to do PhDs finish their school by 25. The results are exactly the same. So that's the other result. Okay, so how do we calculate maternal employment, or how do we measure maternal employment? For each year, so let's say we have maternal employment between 1 and 17. This is the most we have. We construct a 0-1 indicator for whether or not the mother earns more than $1,000 in that year. And then we say she's working. Okay? And then we've got 17 of these 0-1s. We take an average of the 0-1. So it's really a proportion, a bounded 0-1 variable. If ME is 0, it means they didn't work for any of the years we observe them. If it's 1, they worked every year, but it could be any proportion in between. Okay? We've played around with some other definitions. That was a while ago now, but at that time, nothing ever seemed to matter. And we will, at some point, look at maternal employment in different age brackets. So maternal employment between 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 15 to 17, and then it just becomes the proportion out of that interval that the mother was observed to be working. Right, so if you're looking at the ages 15 to 17, it's the average of 3 0-1s. Did you have a question?
Factor, because like you said, for people who are 40, that you observe, daughters of 40 years old, you observe only one employment
right.
of the mother.
So the regression.
for that person, you would have either a 0 or a 1.
Yeah.
How do you factor in the number of years that you observe for each month? Like, because, yeah.
Yeah, so there's two things. One, we've got in the regression, you're going to have year dummies and cohort dummies. So for 40-year-olds in 2005, it's going to soak up the fact that it's going to be 0, 1. But so when we, let's say for that one, we've got, when we separate the maternal employment variable into all these age groups, they're going to have zeros for 1 to 2, 3 to 4, da, 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 da. So then we dummy those that we have a dummy variable, meaning we have no observations for those specific. Okay. So the other dependent variables, so again, thinking about the nature of our data, this is tax administrative data. We construct a measure of, so the daughter's situation growing up, we've got average family market income. So again, if we observe them for 17 years, it's the average of family income normalized to 2005, I think it is, averaged over the 17 years. The percentage of the years the daughter is observed to be in a lone parent family, right? Obviously, single parent versus two-parent family could have differential impacts. And then we've got all this information from the current year, okay? The family status of the daughter now as a grown-up, married, number of children, region size, province, whether they're currently residing with their parents. Turns out, I'm not really going to talk about the coefficients for any of these things. I'm happy to do if you're interested, but residing with your parents makes you more likely to work but earn less money. I was trying to think about that on the plane. I'm like, oh, I guess. If they're an English speaker in Quebec versus a French speaker outside of Quebec, if there's any discrimination based on that kind of language. So it's just basically, did you fill in your taxes in English or French? Their age, the calendar year, so a 40-year-old in 2005 versus all the other possibilities. The age it matched, so we matched the daughters between ages 15 and 19, right? We started, I think, at 19, and then we couldn't match them. Let's try 18, 17, 16, 15. So if somehow we can get, there's some kind of distinction between the daughters that are matched at different ages, if it's correlated with anything interesting, we could pick it up that way. It makes no difference, but something we tried. Missing data regarding maternal employment to capture what you were bringing up before, that there's going to be, when we split it up into age groups, you're going to have no observations to work with for many of them, and the age of mother at birth of the daughter. Okay? What is the effect of having a young mom versus an older mom versus whatever the middle is? Okay, so just to show you a bit of what maternal employment variable looks like, here I've plotted it for those age groups that we talked about, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and this is based on what the literature has found, like these groupings, it's very young age, preschool age, et cetera, and then the later high school age, which in some studies have been shown to have the biggest impact on teen pregnancy and obesity. Having a mom not there at those ages is very important. So what you can see is that the probability, so this would be the average of the 0, 1, 1 zeros for the 1 and 2-year-olds. Okay? So the probability of the one not working at all in that age group declines the older the child and increases the older. And the probability of working all the time within that age group increases. Okay? Not unexpected. And if you look at this, let's see how, it doesn't look near as bad as I feared. Good. So here we break up the sample between people that are always in a lone parent family and daughters that are always in two-parent families. Okay? And what you see, comparing them, you still see the same trends. Probability of never working in an age group falls. As the older the kid gets, the probability of working every year increases the older the child gets. But if you compare the two, you see that daughters from lone parent families are more likely to have had a mother working for every age group. And if you're in a two-parent family, there's a higher probability that your mother will have worked at all ages in that age group. Okay? And in the paper, we make kind of a big deal about this family type because in our minds, not in our minds, because we believe that a mother not working is very different in a lone parent and a two-parent family, right? If you're in a single-parent family, a mother not working probably means the mother's on welfare. Okay? And we, from these other papers, Gottschalk in particular, there's this intergenerational transmission of welfare use. I don't even know if that's a proper terminology. But in a two-parent family, a mother not working is very different. The family's probably not on welfare. It may be because the father's earning enough money that the mother doesn't have. It's a different situation altogether. So the effect of maternal employment could be very different for these two family types. Okay, and just to give you an idea of the distribution of earnings, if you look at here, I spent so long trying to get this black and white to submit to a journal that it's kind of unfortunately that I've lost all that beautiful color. I couldn't find my old nice colored one. But if you just trust me here, so I looked just at observations for a daughter when she was 30. We've got tons of those. The distribution of earnings, lawn earnings, when the mother never worked is further to the left than when the mother worked sometimes, and furthest to the right is the solid line, the mother always worked. So the average earnings are higher. So just looking at the raw data, the density of earnings is shifted to the right the more the mother worked. Okay. So the main results. Yeah. So let's look at this is the OLS, or the linear probability model estimate. We'll start with that. Obviously, so here we're going to start with the dependent variable, is the daughter working or not working? And what I did not put in the table, but I thought it would look too messy, is the probit. We also have a probit, looks just like the linear probability. The reason I report linear probability is because the fixed effect, the IV, is based on that. Okay, so you can trust me, you can look at the paper. Linear probability is not causing anything skewy compared to a probit. What it tells us is that compared to a daughter whose mother did not work at all between the ages of 1 and 17, to when the mother worked every year between 1 and 17 is associated with a 5.4 percentage point increase in the probability of the daughter working. Okay, family income, the magnitudes are ridiculously small, but higher family income is associated with higher earnings, or higher probability of, the daughter working. Always being in a lone parent family is associated with a 4.6 percentage point lower probability of the daughter working. I've taken out all the other stuff that all goes basically in the direction we expect. And there's our huge sample size. Okay. Again, we're worried that that coefficient is not picking up a causal impact. We want to try these three other strategies to address unobserved heterogeneity. If we use the fixed effect model, the effect of maternal employment goes to 0. Okay, so getting variation, looking at the variation of maternal employment between daughters, right, has no effect on the probability of working. So just to give you an idea of how much variation we're actually talking about, here I've got, I'll come back to the slide again to look at it in a second, but for all the observation we have for daughters 1 to 2 years of age, so 20,000 observations, almost 28,000. We have 2,355 sister pairs, or sisters. The number of those that have sisters, I guess that's double counting sister pairs, I guess. Now don't forget, it's not enough to have a sister, we need the sister to be in the lab, right? So it's, it took me a long time. I remember having to sit there going, does this seem right? Like, are we getting enough? Like, are we? And I'm trying to think through my thought process, but we convinced ourselves that this is right. Like, even though a lot of people have sisters, we need the sister to also be in the lab, right? And be of the right age that we could pick up at least maternal employment. She has to be between 20 and 40, and she has to have some maternal employment that we could look at as well, okay? So of those, 1,425 have the same maternal employment, 930 have different maternal employment for that age group, okay? So that's about a 40% have different maternal employment, and so it's off those differences that we're identifying the effect, okay? Now, not surprisingly, as you go up to age 15 to 17, even though we've got more observations for the later years, right? Because we've got one observation for every daughter potentially at age 17. Maternal employment is the same for 6,700. and different for about 2,000. So this is about a 22% have different maternal employment, but that's what we'd expect given what we've already looked at, right? The older a daughter gets, the more likely the mother is to work, right? So we know there's a lot more maternal employment the older the child gets, so we can't be surprised that we've got fewer observations to identify off of, okay? But if you think about where our variation's coming from, oh no, I'm getting ahead of myself, I'm sorry. Okay, so that's the fixed effect model. I believe we've got a decent amount of variation in maternal employment between sister pairs. The effect goes away. Now this negative, so do you see the market income goes from a positive to a negative? Puzzling. But we figured we'd figured out. We believe we know why. So the story here is that it's a birth order story. Are you familiar with this literature? Kentarovic, Masculin, there's a few other things that look at, I don't think of this because I'm an older sibling, but the older siblings tend to do better, right, compared to higher order birth order children, right? So if you think of, and if you believe that family income goes up over time, right, if you've got two daughters, who's going to be the daughter with a higher average income between 1 and 17? The younger. But a birth order story, so the higher, right? She gets more income because the family income is going up over time, right? But she does worse because she's a younger kid, right? So higher income is associated with the lower kid. The younger kid has worse outcomes, okay? So we're not the only one to find this. Jennifer Stewart, my co-author, has published work with Martin Dooley, and when they've got a fixed effect model, they actually find that income, you know, a fixed effect between sisters or families, that income does become negative. The magnitude is still quite small. Well, I can't remember the units exactly, so I'm not going to interpret it right now, but the magnitude is close. Did you have a thought, Danielle?
So I'm looking at the always lone mother family, and I'm wondering how you could be in an always lone mother family and have sisters, that there won't be many cases like that.
Well, imagine you could, because the data is so big. Imagine that between 1 and, so let's say a daughter was always lone mother up until, okay, you and I are sisters. You'll be my older sister. It was always lone mother until you left the house. When you turned 18, I'm still younger than my mother married. Right? So it's going on between what happens between 1 and 17. So if the change happened, or it was always, right?
Always lone mother family is for the daughter.
Right.
Okay, that's what I.
Sorry, these are all between the ages of 1 and 17.
So my comment is no.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the important story is that even though we have what looks to be a role model effect, a positive effect of maternal employment, fixed effect, the effect goes away. If we use IV, the effect goes away. Okay? Now these things behave a little more, they actually don't change at all between the two regressions. If we look at the t-stat of the instrument, minus 3.67. Rule of thumb, if the f t squared is greater than 10, we've got a good instrument. Passes. Closer to like 12, 13 or something. The Hausman test, however, says that the OLS is consistent. Which it is what it is for now. We'll get back to that. The Gottschalk story, on the other hand, also says the same thing. Remember here we've got the measure of maternal employment, ages 1 to 17. We include a measure of maternal employment after the year of the observation. So the sample size is going to drop because we have to lose 2005, the most recent year, because we need a year of maternal employment after. Okay, so the sample size drops, but the effect of maternal employment after is basically of the same magnitude as maternal employment before. Okay, this is highly suggestive of the fact that there's a lot of unobserved heterogeneity. And the Gottschalk method would then suggest that if this is even statistically significant, you've got unobserved heterogeneity, you don't have any estimate of causal impact. Okay, so certainly when the dependent variable is working, it certainly seems that there is no long-term effect of mother working on daughter's outcome of working. We looked at that already. When we look at, so this is a conditional regression, so conditional on working, how much do you earn? You may start by saying, if you're really good at math, you'd say, wait a second, the difference between the ends in the previous table and this one is very small. The estimate based on this would be of employment is about 88% employment for women 20 to 40. We've already excluded schools. Oh, that looks a little high. Well, two things. One, if we're excluding anyone in this data, it's people who earn no money, right? The only people that have the incentive really not to file taxes, even though I'm now starting to believe that they have a lot of incentive to file taxes, is people that make no money, but you can imagine those are people that you're going to be missing. And we're not looking at a point in time, we're looking over a year. So the probability of working at any point in a year is higher than if you asked today what the unemployment rate would be. Okay. So here again, we get this positive role model story in the OLS. You increase maternal employment. You go from a situation of not working at all between 1 to 17 to working every year between 1 to 17. Increases your probability of your daughter, increases daughter's earnings by 5.8%. You contribute 5.8. So it's big. Big positive role model story. Once you add a fixed effect, it becomes negative and marginally significant. So this is statistically significant at the 10% level when we've got a sample size of over 827,000. 10% is really not all that significant. You could make the argument that that's not statistically significant. And again, if you're worried about the negative sign, think of a birth order story, right? If the way I explained it in the paper, I said, listen, suppose the rule is that the mother stays at home until the kid is 10 for all her kids. Okay? Remember, we're identifying after sister pairs. So if you compare the oldest sibling and the youngest sibling, who's got more maternal employment? The youngest, right? Because for the oldest, the mother kept coming, staying home a lot. Okay? But the youngest kid's going to do worse. So higher maternal employment is associated with lower earnings. Okay? So you could say, okay, 0. You could say that's overestimated. You could say, it's a birth order story. Now, why can't, you might say, well, why don't you just control for freaking birth order, right? The problem is that we can only identify relative birth order. So what we're worried about is, let's say we've got this 17-year-old in our data, okay? We observe the family at that point, right? So if there's an older sibling living at home, we could tell. But if very likely that at 17, any older siblings have gone. So we've got no way to know we can identify an older sibling. We could see if there is younger, but we can't identify who's for sure the oldest. Right? So we have tried regressions where we've included an indicator for being the older. Nothing changes. I believe it is significant in the way we expect, but the story doesn't change it. Okay. So again, the limitations of using some of this administrative data, that in a survey you would know more information on the actual family structure. You had fun?
We chose to have the best, the pair of sisters. The first one, the oldest and the youngest.
Sister pairs.
Oh, so you have always the pairs.
Oh, if somehow all of them are in our data set, we use them all.
Oh,
Yeah, we don't drop anybody.
Okay.
No, Okay, and then here's this is what makes me sad. The IV, still statistically significant, right? And passes the rule of thumb. OLS is not, the Hausman test says OLS is not reliable. But here we get this ridiculous estimate that going from a situation where the mother didn't work at all between 1 and 17 to working every year increases earnings by 242%. Then we had to start thinking, is there something wrong with our instrument? Well, maybe, we said. You can imagine, what if, it has to be that the instruments of these average unemployment rates have to only affect daughter's earnings later in life through its impact on maternal employment when the daughter was 1 to 17. So suppose that unemployment rates are very correlated over time, right? So an unemployment rate today, back then, affects the mother's decision to work, but also affects the unemployment rate later on, which affects the daughter, okay? So what we're waiting for right now, being run as we speak, hopefully, is we split the sample into daughters for whom they live in the same place where they grew up, so what we're saying when they were 15, and daughters who have moved away. Because we believe it's going to be a much cleaner sample if we look at just daughters that have moved away. Agree? Because then you then I can't even think of any story why that won't work. Okay. The other thing we're doing is we're trying, because right now we've gone with one instrument. Now we're coding up all sorts of other instruments. So how the number of people in the geographic region who have post-secondary degrees. There's 5 or 6. They're all related to things that people have done in the literature of that spirit. So we're going to try some over-identification tests. So maybe this particular one's not working well for some reason. If we could try to disentangle it in the way I said, we will. That's where we're at with that. Okay, and again, the Gottschalk again tells the same story. Maternal employment after the observation, very similar in magnitude to maternal employment before, suggests that we've got a major unobserved heterogeneity problem. No causal interpretation. So then, what happens when we break down maternal employment into different age groups? Okay, so we talked about doing this already. So here I'll just report the maternal employment variables between ages 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 19 to 7, 15 to 17. The OLS would predict this U-shaped response. Maternal employment has a positive effect, strong positive effect when the daughter's very young, and when she's close to the end of high school, not so much in between. Okay? This is only interesting for a second because then you look at anything else and the effect's basically gone, right? If you look at fixed effects, the magnitude, well, actually, there looks bigger, but here becomes less statistically significant, and here the magnitude falls and is again less statistically significant. So in general, it looks that together the effect's getting smaller with fixed effects. If you look at an IV, you get nothing left. If you look at the Gottschalk, again, you get the maternal employment after to be very highly statistically significant, suggesting, again, a lot of unobserved heterogeneity. And when you look at lawn earnings, again, for the conditional regression, again, you see this strong, it looks like the ages, maternal employment later on in high school where the action is. When you instrument, you get these negative effects. Again, could be the birth order story. When you instrument, you have nothing. And again, the Gottschalk, you get the coefficient for maternal employment after in 15 to 17 are almost. Okay? And as I said earlier on, we're always interested in this, what is the effect on family type? Right? What if we split the sample by family type? So here we have daughters that were always in 2-parent families. So again, with independent variable working, always in a lone parent family, always or sometimes in a lone parent family. Okay? And if you look at the always, so let's just look at the linear probability. I mean, remember, why were we splitting the sample out? Because we said, well, look, maternal not working could be very different in a single-parent family and in a 2-parent family. Not working in a single-parent family probably means that there's welfare. Not working in a 2-parent family, probably not welfare. Okay, so working could be very different. So, and you can imagine that the role model effect might be amplified in the lone mother family because there's only one role model. So, perhaps not surprisingly, the biggest effect in OLS, in terms of magnitude of maternal employment, is for the less stable family types, lone parent and the sometimes lone parent. Just look at the magnitude of the coefficient relative to the OLS. What happens when you identify off sister pairs? The effect 0, 0, basically 0. Okay. What happens when you instrument? Nothing, nothing, nothing. Gottschalk. Okay. So really, with the working, if all this whole paper was on the probability of working, I think I would have completely convinced you there's no long-term effect. But then there was this other part of the paper where I said, well, let's look at earnings. And, not surprising because we've already seen what happens with the full sample. Again, you'd see that the strongest effects on earnings are on for the less stable family types. Fixed effect, you get a bunch of 0 effects. IV here, we've got these positive, negative, so this is a bit all over the place. This is where the big numbers came from before. But again, the instruments work great. OLS is not consistent, but a 75% increase in your earnings because your mother worked every year. Is that really believable? But Gottschalk, again, if you compare the maternal employment before and after, it's all indicative of numbers. So, what can we conclude? At the very least, I hope I've convinced you that OLS, linear probability, is going to overestimate the true relationship between maternal employment and daughter's probability that the daughter works and how much she earns, with the asterisk. And I know it's not 100% clear, but you wouldn't believe me if it was exactly right. And what is this really? What policy implications does this really bring about? Well, it calls into question the growing concern that you hear a lot about the negative effects of maternal employment. That in the long run, maybe in the short run, maybe there's something going on, but you don't have to worry so much in the long run. I think that's all I had. For your the next steps, we're replicating the study using a sample of daughters and sons, looking at the impact on educational attainment. So maternal employment between 1 to 17 on the probability of going on to university. It's a very different sample because of the nature of how you can identify education in the lad. Up until, I think, 92, you could give your tax deductions to your parents, so you couldn't identify the child, or it was 90, there was some year, there's some cutoff, 92, 96. But after that, the daughter has to claim it herself, so there's more of an incentive for the daughters to file. So maybe that's why we're not too worried about education, because now, in the more recent sample, daughters, if they want to claim the tax deductions, they have to file their taxes themselves. Anyway, so it's a very different sample, but the story is going to be the same. Maternal employment on education, and we're going to look also at other outcomes. We're going to look at lone parent status, low income status, dependence on social services.
You were mentioning, where do you get the information about education? It's from the tax return itself?
Yeah, so I could look it up, but I'll go over.
And sons?
Yeah, so you have to, so when you're a student, you get a tax receipt. There's like a T. Anyone remember T8, T7? There's a form that you have to fill out. So after a certain year, the child, the student themselves, has to fill it out. So there's a thing that says very clearly, are you a full-time, are you a part-time student? How much did you pay in tuition? So we could see that. So we're using just a sample where we can identify it cleaner.
So you wouldn't know whether the degree has been completed or not, but you would know that the person was attending.
Post-secondary,
Yeah,
and you
okay.
could see how many years. And then you could hope that, after 6 years, maybe someone felt bad enough to give them a degree.
Is there a possibility that there would be some kind of regional effect that, the results could be different in Quebec compared to the rest of Canada?
The distinct society. Probably. I'd have to think. I mean, the big change that, the 13th anniversary of this child care policy, I'd have to think a bit about, go back to the slide with all the years, whether the daughters are old enough. If it only happened 13 years ago, these kids aren't yet at the outcomes that we're going to measure yet. So not that policy difference. We do have province dummies. It'd be important. Yeah, it'd be good to write, this is the difference when you have the data yourself versus you have someone else run it for you. If you have it yourself, oh yeah, you try all these things. No, but you're right. I can't think of a story offhand, but there very well could be, and that'd be very interesting. If there was some policy that affected maternal employment decisions between the years that we observe maternal employment, then we could definitely find some clever identification there.
Because we know that the policy had a huge impact on maternal employment.
Yeah, but I think, so what's 13 years ago? 97. Okay, I can't find the, let's just do it this way. I just can't get the mouse on the screen. But you can see it. Look, it's fine. Okay, so it started there. So the problem is that affected new moms, right? So we couldn't see anything there, right? Because that's not going to affect maternal, unless it wouldn't. Unless people who had 12 to 17-year-olds had another baby that affected maternal employment here. Affected whether the mom stayed home there. So you'd be looking,
But the daughters could be affected.
the daughters could be affected, yeah.
It
So
doesn't affect on the labor force participation like women.
right. So, but we would look at the mother. So it would be the mothers here, right? So we'd only be able to look at these outcomes here, right? And you need mothers. You need to know that there was enough mothers of 12 to 17-year-olds that had babies in Quebec in our data over that time period. But you're right, we could. Look, that's what we'd identify off of. How many people have accidental babies, or maybe people plan to have babies 15, 17 years apart. That's what you need, right? Could be. I mean, that's the advantage of this lab. I mean, it's so big that, if this happens, we're going to get enough of them to maybe see it. That's a good idea. And I'll think about that.
Yeah, for the IV when you control for unemployment rate and
Mhm.
impact, you say you will look at people who move versus people who didn't move. Another way wouldn't be to look at select out regions where it did change. Like you see the unemployment rate is very different. The one that daughters experience is very different from what mothers experience.
That's an excellent
You
idea.
would have a selection of people choosing to move away because their region doesn't need it. So it would be more of a random.
That's true, because it's not random who decides to leave.
Yeah, no,
Right.
people who move are probably more willing to work there.
No, you're absolutely right. Didn't think of that. Thank you.
Il y a des questions à McGill? Il y a d'autres questions ici? Catherine, est-ce qu'il y a des choses que tu voudrais ajouter ou
No, I had a great time here. Thank you. Very fun. Absolument. Je l'envoie sur le train. Ça m'arrive.
the PowerPoint will be available with the yeah, as well as the PowerPoint. Thank you. Merci
Thank
beaucoup,
you.
Catherine. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks.